Hi guys, thanks for joining me here. In this particular video what I want to discuss is the subject of how to fine-tune your long pips or your anti-spin to, I guess, just to tweak it the way you like it. So we're not talking about big radical changes here, such as going from say a very frictionless long pips to a very grippy long pips. We're talking about how to make small adjustments just to get that last little bit closer to perfection, I guess. So rather than sort of talking about taking big changes, we're talking about how small adjustments in either our blade, small adjustments in the top sheet type of the pips or anti-spin, small adjustments in the sponge, how these things can affect and tweak the rubber itself. So to start with, I'll start discussing long pips because that's probably a little bit more complex, and we'll finish with the anti-spin, which will be a little bit more simple. So again, I'm going to draw on my own experiences of late in terms of my own use of long pips to help illustrate along the way. It'll make things a little bit easier to understand. Now, to give you a starting example, I was using this particular bat here, which is a Butterfly Matsushita Pro Special with Tackiness Chop 1.1 red on the forehand, and the Stiga Destroyer Ox long pips, no sponge on the backhand. Now, this particular Stiga Destroyer is what I would call almost a middle of the range long pips. It's not super wobbly, it's not super tricky in that respect. So you don't see a lot of wobble off every ball. It's fairly good control. It doesn't do a lot of strange things off your bat in comparison to some others. So the control is fairly good, especially when chopping back from the table. So that was why I was liking it. Not that easy to hit with, not terrible, but not easy to hit with either. It's fairly grippy, it's softish, it's not stiff, the actual pips themselves. So they're grippy, softish pips that will bend quite reasonably freely. Not super soft, not the softest I've seen, but they're not a stiff, hard pip. An example of that is I was using this rubber for over a year and just only lost the one pip. They're quite durable, so they're not stiff and prone to fracture. Now, what we were talking about in terms of how can we tweak this a little bit, what adjustments can be made so that although, say, the overall feel and play of the rubber is not changed greatly, perhaps what could I do to tweak it in certain directions depending on what I wanted to do. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how, if I changed certain things, how it affected the overall play in the rubber. Now, the first example is probably one of the big changes, the more radical changes. And what that was I did actually change and step up from this particular blade, the Matsushita Pro Special. I changed and went back to my T-Mobile Spirit, my Butterfly T-Mobile Spirit. Now, according to Butterfly, the Matsushita Pro Special is a medium speed blade, an arylate carbon, arylate carbon 3 plywood, a semi-large defensive blade. The T-Mobile Spirit is again arylate carbon, but a medium fast, size regular type offensive. So a quicker blade. Now, what I noticed was also on the forehand side, I went to a thicker, instead of a 1.1 rubber, went to a 2mm rubber. So overall, the weight the weight isn't all that much different. It's slightly differently distributed in some ways, but it's not greatly different because the head size of the Matsushita is a little bit bigger than the T-Mobile Spirit, but the T-Mobile Spirit has thicker sponge. So it's not radically different in weight. I mean, I'm sure there'll be some difference. But one thing I noticed, and my opponents noticed straight away, so it wasn't even just me thinking, oh yeah, I had some of my opponents come up and say this, is that when I went to the faster blade, what happened was I actually started to get more of the wobble effect and more unpredictability from the long pips. Now, thinking about kind of why that might happen, really all that's happened is there's still no sponge on it. The blade is bouncier, and just to demonstrate, here's the Matsushita Pro. This is the T-Mobile Spirit. I've got a couple of balls here. I'll try and bounce these from a relatively even height, just so you can kind of get an idea for yourself the slightly different bounciness. And try that again. So, one last time. The T-Mobile is a little bit quicker in the rebound. Certainly feels faster off the blade, and feels that there's a little bit less dwell, which is to be expected off a slightly quicker blade. Now, what I'm speculating here is that because the ball is probably not staying as long on the pips, there's less chance for the pips to grip, and I'm getting more of a glassy, frictionless type slightly effect, especially when playing anything flattish where I don't bend the pips a lot. And because I'd also changed in the style from chopping to standing up to the table and push blocking a lot more, I think that was also reflected in the style change a little bit. But definitely in comparison to this side, going to this one, it dwells a little bit less, and hence I get a little bit more wobble, a little bit more effect. The other thing that happens is because it's bouncing faster off the T-Mobile Spirit blade, my opponent has less time to react. So he feels that it's more difficult as well, because it's coming back to him a little bit more quickly. So here what we've got is, by changing to basically a quicker blade, what we've done is we've increased the unpredictability a little bit, because we've reduced the amount of time it stays in contact with the pips, and hence also the ball's going back to the opponent faster. He has less time to react to any wobbling going on. So again, one example of tweaking. So if you are looking to increase the amount of effect of the wobble and to get a little bit more wobbling, you could look at going to a quicker blade, and that would probably help achieve it. A bigger step than maybe just a little tweak, however not a radically, the overall feel, it's still the same rubber, it's just a little bit quicker. So that's one possibility. Now, what I also had to take it to the next step is, that's just one thing, that's changing the blade. So obviously if you go to a slightly slower blade, you'll probably find that you'll get even less wobble, and so it's something to be aware of. Now, in terms of long pips, what other things have we got that we can play with? Well, the blade we've talked about just a little bit there. We've also got the actual, I guess, the type of the long pip, the amount of bend of the long pips, the amount of grip of the long pips. That's also something that you could change. Now, that's, I think, a slightly more radical. That's not what I would necessarily call fine-tuning my long pips. What that is the issue of choosing your long pips. And what I'm trying to discuss here is basically, if you've got the long pips that you like, what can you do to modify their behaviour a little bit? So that's kind of more like a thing of, well, you know, if you're looking for a stiffer top sheet, you're buying a different type of long pips. There's not a lot you can do to stiffen, well, I tell a lie. if I wanted my Stiga Destroyer long pips to be stiffer and harder, what could I do to change that? Well, I could leave them in the back seat of my car in the sun for a few days. That would probably stiffen and harden them. The only problem with that is it's illegal to do that. You're really materially changing the rubber. So I don't recommend that. It's pretty much just saying, you know, you're basically trying to cheat. So no, that's not on. If you're trying to do that, look for a stiffer long pip. Same with making these frictionless. People used to do stuff like put super glue on the top of the pips so they became frictionless. Again, we're talking illegal, so that's not. I'm not going to really go there. I'm not encouraging anybody to do anything illegal. We're looking at how to do the best we can with legal rubbers. So, assuming that we're keeping that top sheet and we're just trying to tweak things a little bit, the other things we can do is we can put some sponge underneath it. Okay. Now, if I put some sponge underneath it, things change again. And this again, calling on my own experience, for preparation for this video, I didn't want to just go in and start talking. I wanted to have a bit of a refresher. I used to use TSP Curl P2, which is a medium pip with 1mm sponge. And it went out of production, and I was looking around, and I ended up with Destroyer, and at the same time was recommended by Paul Pinkovich to go to a ox rubber to help control power loops coming at me. So I ended up going from the Curl P2 in 1mm sponge to this Stiga Destroyer ox. Now, because I did actually try a Stiga Destroyer in 1mm sponge, just out of comparison wise, later on down the track I thought I should. I didn't like it so much when chopping. I actually did prefer the ox for chopping, but I had this sheet around, so I thought, well, okay, let's put it on, and now that I'm standing up close to the table, let's use it a little bit so that I can give you not something that I remembered from several years ago, but I can give you, you know, what's going on now. And some interesting things happened. Now, firstly, again, I'm just going to compare the speeds. This side here is the Stiga Destroyer, still the same. They're both T-Mobile Spirits blades. They're both Fortissimo red 2mm on the forehand. So the forehand side and the blade is actually exactly the same. The only difference is this is ox, this is 1mm sponge. And again, just trying to give you a simple bounce test. It's possible to see that, again, this is another step. Add the sponge, and the sponge adds a little bit more bounciness to it, a little bit faster instead. Again, now in practice, though, when I come to use this, so you would expect, well, it's faster, okay? We've gone another step faster, so therefore, in terms of bounciness, we should be getting more wobble, more strange effects, and the ball going back faster, so puts my opponent under more pressure. That was what happened when I went to a faster blade with no sponge. I got all of that. Here it's the same blade, added sponge, and did that happen? No, it didn't. Didn't happen at all. It's actually completely the reverse. By adding 1mm sponge, what actually happened was I got less wobble. I did increase my speed off the bat a fraction. It did increase it a fraction. But what actually happened was my control felt like, even though my speed went up, I felt like my control went up as well. Okay? But at the expense of any wobble, which is a bit strange. It's actually kind of reverse of what you think would happen. So by making the bat a little bit faster, I actually improved my control, cut down the amount of wobble. And so having to think about that, I mulled it over a little bit and kept playing around with it. I wasn't really sure what was going on until I started to do some other things where I started to practice a little bit of hitting and counter driving against a top spin ball, and also hitting against a backspin ball. and actually hitting with the rubber, not just blocking, but actually hitting freely with the rubber and counter driving freely with the rubber. And it's about that point where I started to catch on to what was going on. Because what I found is, by adding the 1mm sponge, what I did was I actually I got a bigger margin for error in terms of the response, and I got a much more consistent response. Now what I mean by that is, to give you an example, when someone loops the ball, and I was going with the long pips with no sponge, and I would try and counter loop. Remember I was talking about in previous videos using that brush loop? Yep, okay. Now what would happen was, I was originally, when I was trying to use that shot, it would work often, and then occasionally the ball would dive right off my rubber straight down, and then on other occasions the ball would go straight up. And sometimes, you know, not all the time, but quite a lot of the time it would go as expected. And I kind of figured that, well, hey, that's just me not getting the bat angle right, still learning the technique. So I figured it was basically my fault with it. And to an extent, quite possibly it was. But as I continued to practice, it never really changed a lot. There was always occasions where the ball just dropped off my bat or bounced really high off my bat. And when I thought about it, it was the same often when I'd be blocking against a loop coming in. Quite often the ball would drop off my bat or jump off my bat, even with just a simple motion. Now, when I went to the long pips with the sponge, what happened was all of that, or pretty much 90% of that, disappeared. So very rarely did I go to block against a loop and have the ball drop off my bat. It tended to jump a little bit more, so the throw was a little bit higher, but it wasn't that I didn't get the jump up high that I occasionally got with the Ox pips. So although it did actually go a little bit higher, it was much more consistent. So say here, for argument's sake, maybe out of 10 shots, just to give you a rough, it's not an exact proportion, but to give an example, 2 might have dropped off, 2 might have jumped, and that leaves you with 6 that did what they want. In here, it would be very rare for anything to drop off the bat. You might get 1 out of 20, to drop off. Again, you might get 1 out of 20 to really jump, and the rest are fairly consistent. So it smoothed out all those funny bounces coming back off the bat, both when me blocking against someone's loop and also when I went to counter hit. Now that was the nice thing that I liked about this, is when I went to counter hit, suddenly it felt like more or less counter hitting with a smooth rubber. Not a quick one, obviously, or a super spinny one, but very much put your bat over and play your counter hit off someone's loop, and it reacted. It didn't fall off the bat, it didn't jump, it behaved like a nice, smooth, slow rubber. Whereas the long pips with this no sponge quite often would jump or die, occasionally do what I wanted. So what I think happened was, by adding the sponge, what we've done is the sponge gives the pimples a little bit more ability to sink. The pimples can sink into the sponge a bit. Gives them a bit more chance, I think, to bend, because even though it's bouncier, I think you get a little bit more dwell. You actually can go into the sponge, compress it, and bounce off. So although it's quicker, I think you actually increase the amount of time that the ball stays on the pimples. You increase the amount of bending the pips can do, because they can actually bend into the sponge a little bit and sink into the sponge. And what you then get is, because of that, I think what's happening is we're getting longer dwell times. I'm getting more consistent, I think, also treatment of the pips. And what I mean by that is, if you think about it with pips sitting basically on the wood, if I want to bend pips, some will go in a certain direction, but some will also not have room. They'll get compressed straight into wood, and so they may bend in odd angles, which also I think increases the unpredictability. When you do that on sponge, there's a bit more room for the pips to move in the same direction, and I think you get a more predictable response from the pips because they can bend a little bit into the sponge rather than getting shoved the other way by being pushed straight into wood. So, by adding 1 mil sponge, what have we done? We've actually gone, although we've increased the speed, the sponge has basically cut down the unpredictability effect a little bit. So I've lost some unpredictability, some wobble, and some of the up-down nature, the pace and dropping off the bat or jumping off the bat. I've lost some of that. What I've gained though is firstly, against topspin balls coming at me, looped balls coming at me, I've gained the ability to counter hit predictably. For me, the feel is the same. I know exactly what angle to hold it, and it goes off, and it's consistent for me. I don't have to guess. It doesn't jump on me or drop off at me. It's just a matter of play the stroke. So it's improved that for me. Against backspin balls, when I want to open up, the sponge also allows the pips to bend a bit more, and I find that I can open better. I get a more consistent response, again, then compared to the long pips with ox. Also, because the sponge allows me to bend the pips a bit more in all the same direction, I think I can generate more spin with it. So for me, what I've found is this tweaking by adding the 1 mil sponge, at the cost of a little bit of wobble and unpredictability, what I've gained is the ability to basically play chop block with a predictable result of feel for me. I can counter hit now the looped ball with again another predictable feel for me, no strange things happening to me. If someone pushes, I can now actually open without having the ball dive or jump off my bat a lot. Again, more consistent. I'm losing a little bit of my opponent's hesitation to an extent because it's more predictable, but I am getting the ability to hit more of them and be more aggressive, and that also compensates. So a little bit of interesting tweaking going on by adding the sponge there, I thought. Now, this is because this is I guess a quicker sponge. You know, if it was a dead sponge, if it was a very slow sponge, like an anti-spin type sponge, that would be obviously interesting to speculate what might happen. You would still gain some of that, I think, predictability, because the pips would still be able to sink into the sponge. You would lose some pace, obviously, so I think you would also possibly, you might increase the dwell a bit more and even lose more effect if you use it with a very dead slow sponge. So it could be a problem in that respect, that by going to a slower sponge, you may find that not only do you drop pace, but you actually drop the wobble effect even more. Something to be aware of. I certainly know that one of my students who was using a Hallmark Frustration, he was using it in a 2 mil sponge, very thick, very quick sponge, and the ball wobbled like crazy. It did all sorts of strange things, but he could still hit with it. It felt fairly consistent, but it did still wobble. I think because the sponge was quick, very fast sponge. Whereas this Destroyer sponge is quicker, but not a lot quicker, I think, than the Ox, but a little bit quicker. So again, by changing the sponge, adding sponge to it, I've changed the characteristics a little bit. In terms of the tweaking though, what I've changed is the way it plays a little bit. I haven't really greatly changed the feel. So I haven't had to relearn my bat angles or do any of that stuff. All that's happened is it's just lost, whereas before I'd play this stroke and it would work and occasionally do funny things. Now I play the stroke and it works. And it just responds consistently. So for me that's good, that's what I'm wanting at the moment. So I've actually, for the time being, I'm changing to using the 1 mil sponge Stiga Destroyer, and I'm hoping to get a little bit of video later on today of me playing my training partner and try and show you how I'm trying to use it now, and see if we can pick up a little bit of a difference, and we'll comment on that later. Okay, so I think pretty much in terms of this tweaking, we've talked about changing the blade, we've talked about changing the sponge, any other minor tweaking that you could do. One thing to be aware of is probably also is whether you clean it. I don't clean my long pips very often. It's sort of like maybe once every 3 months I'll run a sponge over it. I don't really think about it very much. It's something I'm going to think about more because I do actually want to keep that grip to play. So that's going to be something that I think I'll probably be working on more. But if you leave them and let them get dirty, they're going to behave more frictionless. So, yeah. So as I was saying, whether you clean them or not, I think can have an effect. The less you clean them, the less spin you're going to get, the more they're going to become more like a frictionless long pips. As I said, I clean mine every 3 months or so. I'll probably start cleaning it every couple of weeks just to keep it in consistent condition. But if you didn't clean them, then probably by about 6 months, you'll cut down the amount of spin generation quite a lot. And it will become a little bit more probably prone to wobbling and a little bit less grippy because of that as well. So that's a grey area. Do you have to clean your rubbers? I mean, ideally, I think your rubbers are supposed to play the way with the original characteristics. So if you had an inverted rubber and didn't clean it for 6 months, it certainly wouldn't play the way the original rubber was. So again, I think it's not something that's really been addressed, because what's happening there is just natural dirt accumulation that's affecting the rubber. It's not anything you've done to it to treat it. It's just wear and tear coming off the balls, dust coming off the balls. So whether you are sort of duty bound to give them a clean every now and again is something that I really don't know. I would probably, if hard put, say yes, you probably should, because you're not playing with a rubber that has its original characteristics. So if hard put, I'd probably say yes, you should clean it every so often. Having said that, I really don't know how often I need to clean this to keep it near its characteristics. It may be it only needs a clean every 4 months or so. No one that I know has done any studies on it. How would you tell? It's very hard to tell that and know what the right thing is. But what I'd probably say is it's probably better to clean it fairly regularly, just from the point of fact that when your rubber eventually wears out and you buy a new rubber, you've suddenly got a rubber that feels completely different. It's grippier than the old one that you replaced. Not so good. So I tend to say give it a clean every so often, just so that it stays consistent. Now, I did mention that I wanted to talk about anti-spin as well. Now, anti-spin again I think is a similar situation in terms of what you've got to play with. You've got the slower blade versus the quicker blade. I think if you go to a faster blade, you'll again tend to reduce dwell time, you'll increase hopefully the amount of wobble, and you'll increase probably effect. Now, because with anti-spin being a smooth inverted rubber, there'll always be some sponge. So in this particular cases, by adding more sponge, you are probably, and I say this because depending on the top sheet, different things could happen, but the more sponge you add, probably the faster the sponge, the bat will get, which will tend to reduce dwell time. But the more sponge you add, the more ability you allow for the ball to sink in to the sponge, increasing the amount that it can wrap around, decreasing the amount of wobble effect. Not to mention the fact that if you've got a stiff top sheet on the anti-spin versus a softer top sheet, that can have effects as well. But again, I'm talking about tweaking a particular rubber. So what I'd say is, in this sort of case here, the one I've got here is Yasaka Anti-Power, which is a fairly soft top sheet. And while it's certainly not grippy, anything like an inverted rubber, there is a little bit of friction. Now what I would find with this kind of one is by adding, going to a thicker sponge, what's going to tend to happen is the sponge itself is very dead. To give you an example, this is my long pips ox, and this is the Antispin. Just drop the balls again, and you can see very dead, very slow. So regardless of whether I add a lot more sponge, and this I think is actually, looks like a 2mm sponge to start with. So this is probably the thickest anti-power you can get in the 1.9 or 2. So I don't think you'd get a thicker one. You might get a thinner one, possibly. So by going to a thinner sponge, what I would probably be able to get is a little bit more of the ball hitting into the wood of the racket, because the top sheet is soft, it sinks into the sponge a bit. So if I went to a thin 1.0 sponge underneath the Antispin, I'd tend to probably reduce the amount that the ball sinks in. I would then probably increase the Antispin effect, the wobble effect type thing. I'd also make it probably a little bit harder to actually generate any spin of my own, so I'd be increasing the wobble at the expense of my any attacking capabilities. So that would be something to watch for. Whereas if the top sheet was very, very hard, and an example of that is something like the Butterfly Antispin, Butterfly Super Anti, has a very much harder top sheet. There was a Dr. Nabal one that sticks in my mind as incredible, because the top sheet was actually rock hard. It felt like wood. It was that hard. But the Butterfly Super Anti is still much, much stiffer than the Anti-Power, and a bit slicker, even less grip. In those sort of cases, if you add more sponge to the Butterfly Super Anti, you'll probably decrease the dwell time even more. But the top sheet is so stiff, it probably won't make much difference regardless. It wouldn't wrap around very much anyway. So changing sponge thickness probably wouldn't change your wobble very much at all. It might affect your pace a little bit and give you a little bit more pace, except for the fact that, of course, that the pace of the Antispin isn't very quick. Anyway, it's all fairly, as you can see, fairly dead sponge. So in terms of your tweaking here, I think you're a little bit more limited in what you can tweak with your Antispin, because you're really kind of dependent on the stiffness of the top sheet and the pace of the sponge. Are going to probably have more effect than changing the speed of the blade. With a stiffer top sheet, changing the sponge is probably not even going to have much effect. With a soft top sheet like this Yasaka Anti, going to a thicker sponge will probably give you a little less wobble, I would think. So acting like putting more sponge under a long pip. So certainly things to be aware of. So just to recap what I've sort of, again, started with a short video that kind of grew out of expectations. But the point is that really with what I've been playing with this Stiga Destroyer, going from very much a chopping rubber, using it chopping and on a slower blade, getting very good consistency, never a lot of wobble, very good consistency on the chop, the long pip chop. Not so great consistency on chop blocking, or trying to roll, although I always put that down to my technique. But looking back now and looking at it, what I'm thinking is using this slow blade with no sponge was good for chopping, but tended to give me a little bit of unpredictable effect when blocking, but not so bad as when I went to the faster blade with no sponge. What I then got was I got an increase in my unpredictability. That went up. More wobble, more funny bad angles, ball bounces coming off my pips. So tougher on my opponent, but also tougher on me. Because although it felt more or less the same, the times where it did things that I didn't expect also went up. And it all happened faster. So what we did was we went from something fairly safe in pace with occasional unpredictability to something that was much faster, much more unpredictable, worse for my opponent and worse for me. Then going now to the sponge version of it with one little sponge, what's changed is the unpredictability's gone. So in terms of blocking passively with the ball, I've lost some unpredictability. It's easier for my opponent. So if I was a passive blocker at the table, I wouldn't be using sponge. I think I would be going with the ox. More hard effects from my opponent, make life a bit tougher for him. But because I'm trying to use these long pips to basically block as well as when they topspin, I want to be able to roll the ball back, counter drive it back, and when they push at me, I want to be able to loop with the long pips. I think the sponge, in that it gives me a predictable throw angle and a predictable response, that when I play this stroke, I know what height it's going to go and what effect it's going to have, and it feels good for me. What that does is then I can use it for the change of pace, for the type of difference in spin, but I'm not getting some of the funny variations that I was getting with no sponge. So I lose a little bit of unpredictability, but I gain the ability to control the ball and make variations of my own in a controlled manner. And that's what I'm hoping for my style, which is going to be basically playing up at the table, looking wherever possible on both wings to start the attacks. When attacked, chop block or counter drive, and when I'm back a little bit from the table, looping with the forehand, and they hit it to my backhand, I don't want to have to chop block. I want to be able to keep rolling with the pips. Much easier with this. It's a much more predictable, consistent response. I like it a lot more. Now, in 3 months' time, when I've been using this a while, and my opponents locally have had a chance to get used to it, will I still be saying the same thing? Will this turn out in practice the way that I'm theorising? Possibly not. I may find that my opponents will get used to it, I can't put enough pressure on with them, with it, and I may go, oh yuck, I'll go back to something unpredictable. It's possible, but at the moment I'm thinking that this looks like it's going to meet my needs. So, coming back to tweaking, when we're talking about tweaking a rubber that we're already fairly happy with to make small changes or even slightly bigger changes in how it plays, with the long pips, if you're playing with ox, if you go to a faster blade, you'll probably get more effects, slightly more unpredictability on your end. So you'll make more mistakes, but you'll have more effect than your opponent by going to a faster blade. Go to sponge, you'll have less effect on your opponent, but you'll have more control with a faster, it'll go faster, but with more control and much more predictability in terms of how it reacts off your bat. You'll make less mistakes as well, but you'll get less funny effects. So you'll have to be doing something aggressive with it in order to make your opponent miss. Passively blocking the ball back will give your opponent the same sort of thing every time. That's not going to be enough. So you need to be an aggressive hunter of the ball, hunter of the point if you're going to use this stuff, which is what I'm trying to do. And with the anti-spin, I think you're depending on your top sheet. If you've got a stiff top sheet, then probably the sponge is going to make a little difference. A quicker blade will also make a little bit of difference, and in both cases you'll get, I think, a slight more wobble at the expense of a little bit of control. If you've got a softer top sheet, then what you'll probably find is adding more sponge will give you a little bit more sinking in to a certain extent, but you'll also possibly get greater pace off the ball. That's a little bit more tricky to say how that's going to exactly pan out, because there is no anti-spin in ox, so it's kind of harder to say, I think, exactly what's going to happen, because there's that idea of, well, you know, here I'm saying ox goes quickly, but, you know, reasonably quick, I guess, but has certain predictability issues. If I add 1 mil of sponge, this is what happens. What would happen if I added 2 mil of sponge to it instead of 1 mil of sponge? Well, I have used that in my sort of like one of my ex-students' other type of long pips, the Hallmark. And what you basically got was a very much a hard to control, wobbly type thing, because what actually happened there was the sponge that he had was quick sponge, very fast sponge. So I think if you're going to go from no sponge to 1 mil to 2 mil, the effect will depend on what type of sponge. If it's faster sponge, then the more you add, the more unpredictability you'll start getting again, because your dwell time will start to reduce. If it's fairly neutral sponge like this Stiga Destroyer is, the pace isn't a lot different, then I think you'll find you'll tend to even things out to a certain extent. But it's all fascinating stuff, and there's because every long pip's a bit different, every anti-spin's a bit different, every blade is a bit different. I don't think it's necessarily an exact science so much as a bit of an art to actually check, try it and see. But that's what I personally have found myself. So for the moment, 1 mil sponge on the Stiga Destroyer, playing aggressively is how I'm going to be playing. And as I said, I'll see if I can get a little bit of video later on today to try and demonstrate how I'm using this style and whether it is having any positive effects versus negative effects, and maybe just talk you through a little bit of that as well. So again, thanks for putting up with my rambling. It was intended to be a short 10-minute video, but they never seem to turn out that way once I get started. But it's, I think, one of these, it's an interesting subject. Rubbers, blades, how putting them together in certain ways changes the effect of the rubber. I'm fortunate, I guess, to a certain extent, that once I pick something, I usually try and stick with it and don't change it too much. But here I'm certainly finding that by adding the sponge, certain things have occurred that I'm happy with. So I'll need a couple of months to see how it works out, and I'm hoping that it will achieve certain things. But I'll have to revisit it in a month or two to see whether it pans out exactly how I'm hoping. But for the moment, I'm certainly positive and encouraged that I think I can play a good aggressive game with this type of racket. So we'll see. But anyway, thanks for sticking with me, and I'll have more videos to come very, very soon, rather than the big gap that I left over Christmas and New Year. So there'll be more to come on the way.